Delusion. Sometimes when I post, especially about how modern women want a different life from their mother or their grandmother or their great grandmother, there will be some man and sometimes some woman that will say, "Oh my gosh, you should have talked to your grandmother or your mother or your great grandmother," and they would tell you how delusional you are. Well, I have talked to all of them, and they don't say how delusional I am. And the depth of projection and delusion in these statements reminds me of something that I never understood when I was a kid. When I was a child and I was learning about American history, I learned that in 1851, Dr. Samuel Adolphus Cartwright, a physician on a Louisiana plantation, coined the term drapetomania to describe a psychological disorder that caused enslaved people to run away. And he came up with this theory, this hypothesis, that slavery was so much of an improvement over the lives of slaves in previous areas of the world that only those with a mental illness would want to escape. And the treatment that he suggested would be flogging the slaves or amputation, especially of the toes. So when I was a teenager and I learned about this, it just boggled my mind that the owners of these slaves had convinced themselves that the slaves were happy, that slavery was an improvement over freedom in the slaves' native land. They had seemed to have forgotten that they didn't capture slaves, they captured free people who were just as free as them at one time, those that weren't born into slavery. And they had enslaved them, they had institutionalized them, they had taken away their freedom and made them into something that they had not been previously. So the idea that this servitude suited these Africans and was preferable to freedom, to me, it was so far-fetched that anybody would even believe this, that I couldn't even wrap my head around it. But these people that are on my posts and are saying that when women had no rights, they were happier. It sounds exactly to me like the slave masters who would say, well, the slave was happy till he learned how to read, and that just gave him all kinds of unhappiness. And that's why slaves shouldn't be able to read or write, because it's just going to make them discontent with their station in life. This idea that liberal universities or certain TV shows or certain movies or woke curriculum is somehow the only reason why women would want to work, have their own ambitions, have their own goals outside of motherhood and being a wife. The idea that the only reason somebody would leave the church is, again, these liberal institutions, these woke curriculum, these Jezebel spirits that come over them, and not just a plain and simple inner feeling that there's something wrong inside of an institution that idolizes and sees nothing wrong with slavery of any kind, sees nothing wrong with oppression, sees nothing wrong with hierarchical systems that put the power in one group's hands and take the power away from many other groups. So I never understood it and almost found it hard to believe when I was reading about this as a teenager. But now I get to see it in real life. I get to literally have conversations with people who somehow think that single women now are miserable and that their mothers and grandmothers who couldn't vote, who had to ask for an allowance, who were sometimes routinely brutalized and had no option for divorce of any kind, fault or no fault, in many states, couldn't open a bank account without their husband's permission, couldn't get educated, couldn't buy a car, couldn't sign a contract, that these women were somehow happy with all of these restrictions and repressions and omissions of dignity and access. I mean, the only way that I could see that someone will believe any of this is that they see women, and by extension minorities, as some other that is not like them and doesn't have the same needs, desires, ambitions, goals, willpower, motivation that a normal person does, that we have some simpler aesthetic like a cat or a dog or some other animal that's lower on the sophistication scale. Maybe that's why they used to say that minorities were 3/5 of a human being, because they couldn't conceive of the fact that we were fully human and had all of the same feelings and thoughts and wants and needs that they had. So sometimes it makes me wonder whether the same people that I'm talking about in these posts and comments are descendants of the people that believed drapetomania was the only reason that a slave would run away, because a slave couldn't possibly have a desire to be free. That couldn't possibly be the case. They had to literally be mentally ill to want better for themselves, to want more for their lives, to want freedom. That was a mental illness in the description of these people. And that's the same way that some of these people are acting towards women, that we must somehow be mentally deficient or mentally ill to want more or want better for ourselves. And that to me is wild and disturbing and so sad. May you walk in Synergy.